I did it, everyone. I bought an Asus motherboard. More than that, I bought a Republic of Gamers motherboard. So I've had a bit of a negative bias toward Asus for years because for a long period it seemed like every dead motherboard that I encountered, every dead on arrival MOBO that I encountered as well was an Asus board. So they kind of built up a rep with me for just being unreliable motherboards. But this was like 5 to 8 years ago when ROG was barely even a thing. And so I figured it was about time that I buried the hatchet and took an objective look at a modern ROG board to see what all the fuss is about. So this is the STRIX X470-f Gaming. And despite us being about 4 months into the era of X570, this board still commands a price tag of about £180 on Amazon right now. I'm happy to report that I didn't pay that for it. I bought this one secondhand on eBay for £120 and it's in perfect working order. Now, normally when I review a motherboard, it's because the board is cheapest in its class, or it's got a good balance of functionality to take it out of the poor man's class, or it's just got awesome features that I like. But this one I bought on brand name alone. I was browsing eBay for a mid-range X470 board, and I saw ROG STRIX and thought, sod it, I'm buying it. Don't care what it is. It says ROG STRIX. Let's see if that's worth anything. But while it looks pretty impressive and it's got a silly ROG clothing tag on it, I'm honestly not convinced that this thing is remotely worth £180. Not because it's bad, but just because it's just a motherboard. It showed up in the post and I started looking over it and I was like, okay, not much in the way of RGB and no fancy BIOS system and pretty standard connectivity. It does have SLI support, but that's basically it. And it's the kind of feature set I'd expect to see on a Gigabyte board that costs, I don't know, like £140 or so. But that's not to say that it's crap. So on that note, let's do a tour of the board and see what you do get with it. Starting on one of its strongest points, and that is CPU V-Core. This board has got 10 physical phases on it. 8 of them are CPU and 2 of them are SoC. And for those of you who don't know, an SoC is the little system on a chip inside the CPU that controls the CPU. Because what a lot of people don't realize is the CPU itself is divided up into sections, and a modern microprocessor actually has multiple power rails going to it. CPU V-Core is just the big, huge workhorse rail that runs off a 12-volt supply coming into your 8-pin connector. But the SoC, that is also driven off the 12-volt source these days, but SoC and a couple of other voltages that go to it are lighter rails and don't need as much power. But yeah, that's why V-Core is the big workhorse. SoC, though, is the auxiliary that you will see on boards. So these are all hooked up in a 6+2 configuration. The main VRM controller is an ASP1405i, and according to Google and all of my research, that is a rebadged IR35201, and that's International Rectifier. So the IR35201 has 8 PWM outputs on it, making it a pretty respectable controller, but this is where people start getting a bit confused, as we also need to handle that SoC power as well. And when I was looking around online to confirm my research, lots of people were going, oh, it's a 8-phase, or no, it's not, it's got 8 true phases, or it's 6+2, or it's 7+1, and so on and so forth. How it works is that Asus have placed a pair of IR3599 phase doubler chips on the top row of VRMs. This gives 6 directly controlled CPU phases, with the final 2 controlled in tandem through one phase doubler, and then the 2 SoC phases are on the other phase doubler. Given that all these phases are PWM controlled, this is a pretty rad setup, and it gets even better when you get under the VRM heatsinks and find that it has IR3555M MOSFET packages. So these aren't just discrete MOSFETs as you'd find on cheaper motherboards. It's a full regulator in a single chip, meaning that it can talk to the main VRM controller with volts, amps, temperature, and so on, which give the whole thing a very accurate degree of control. So now this is where the cost starts coming into a factor, because this VRM setup is expensive. Now, if you've got, a mid-range motherboard that has 4 discrete MOSFETs, like 2 high-side and 2 low-side MOSFETs, which would be considered fairly decent, those MOSFETs are going to cost about 16 cents each, whereas these integrated packages are actually about $2 a pop. So right away, each VRM on this board is nearly 4 times the price of one on a cheap motherboard, and it's got 10 of them on the board. So you're looking at about $20 parts price just on those chips alone. Moving around, expansion is pretty standard fare for an X470 board. We've got 4 RAM slots, single end hold down, so it's a pain to fit modules into them. We've got 2 M2 connectors, with one up here and one hiding under this heat spreader that requires 4 screws to remove, and then a 5th screw for your actual SSD. Ugh. We've got 3 PCI Express 1x slots and 3 16-length slots. Slot 2 is 8 lanes only, and slot 3 is 4 lanes only, although that's still good enough for a PCI Express SSD or a 4K capture card, which is probably the only 2 things that you'd ever want to put in there anyway. And then finally, we've got 6 good old SATA connectors for those of you who still swing that way. Audio is a pretty respectable 8-channel Supreme FX job with a big bank of Nichicon audio caps, all nicely standing off the board by about 1 millimeter, as they should. And drivers withstanding, this audio should run anything up to top-end headphones without any worries at all. It's certainly going to cover you for any consumer or gamer-grade headset. For headers, we've got a really kick-ass selection of 4-pin fan headers. We've got 7 of them. We've got 2 at the rear I/O. We've got 2 at the CPU, we've got 2 more down the bottom, and we've got another one at the back next to the RAM connectors. The Q-fan utility in the BIOS is kind of dim-witted, but if you drill into the monitor section, you'll find all the fan control stuff that you'd normally expect to see, so that's all there as well. We do also have USB 3.0 and 3.1 headers, and you've got dual USB 2 headers on top of that, giving you 4 internal USB 2 headers for peripherals and things like that. We've got 1 digital RGB header down here with an analog connector next to it, which is not great if you want to drive a big RGB setup without having a separate controller, but it's fine for a couple of RGB fans and an LED strip. It's also got the digital RGB header for the Wraith Max cooler, but I haven't had a chance to investigate how or if this can be used for other stuff as well. Last but not least, we've got the rear I/O, which has a built-in I/O shield, which is awesome because it means you won't lose it. And everything that I want is here. We've got 8 USBs, including USB 3.0, 3.1, 3.2 Gen 2, and Type-C. And we've got HDMI and DisplayPort on top of that as well. Plus, we've also got proper Intel Gigabit networking on top of all of that. So, amazing selection at the back panel here for a mid-range board. So feature set wise, as I hinted earlier on, there's nothing here that I wouldn't expect to find on most other X470 motherboards. I mean, heck, even the MSI X470 Gaming Plus has got most of these features, and it costs £50 less. But what features that this board has, it has the best versions of. Everything is premium on this board. Using the VRMs as an example, you can see why it ended up costing so much. You know, the audio on it is standard fare, but it's really good for what it is. The VRMs are really good for what they are. The fan connectors are really good for what you get. So, is it the ROG tax or is it a premium product? Well, I think it's probably a premium product. This thing oozes build quality. I will give it that much credit. You know, this is one of the best built motherboards I've used in a long time. And admittedly, I generally work with low-end stuff most of the time. So, you know, I'm sure people who deal in super high-end motherboards may scoff at this. But, you know, compared to the usual, you know, around about the £100 mark that I normally aim for with motherboards, this really does feel like it's worth the extra money. But, of course, we have to consider the fact that it is not doing anything that a cheaper motherboard could not do. You know, apart from, you know, like that USB-C type connector or something like that. But you get the idea. So, you know, as I say, when I ran 3D Mark on this, it gave me the same score as my Gigabyte B450 Aura SM that I've got in the shop at the moment. But then the B450 Aura SM is the same board that I spent most of the day recovering from a crap BIOS update and another afternoon getting my 3400 RAM to run at 3400. So I got to admit it, silly clothing logo tag or not, Asus were not messing around with this board. So yeah, I'm not gonna give you a full tour of the BIOS today, because honestly, unless the manufacturer does something really wild with their BIOS design, there's nothing really interesting to see there anymore. Once you've looked at one BIOS, you've seen them all. But suffice to say, it's got all the requisite overclocking settings that you'd want. And the only thing I'd note is that, as I mentioned earlier on, with things like QFan control, some of the settings are not quite where you'd expect to find them. So you may have to do a little bit of digging if you're more familiar with a BIOS like MSI or Gigabyte. The Asus BIOS has what seems to be a completely different layout to the other brands, but it's all in there if you just go digging for it. But what I definitely do like about this board is I do like the aesthetic of it a lot. So the aesthetic on this board, Asus is calling this the cyber outlook. So that's all of this stuff here, you know, with the game on and STRIX and, you know, the flashy stuff. This doesn't light up or anything, which I think is a bit of a shame, but I like the concept behind it. I like all of the silk screen on this board with the writing on it and things like that. It looks futuristic rather than the sort of the gamer military aesthetic that ROG generally goes for. Like, I still don't like the Asus ROG logo. I think this logo looks a bit naff. However, all of this kind of thing, I think that looks pretty cool myself. The only thing I do wish that they would do with it is just give it actually some meaningful writing on it. Like, they've got speed and 25.124798 and just, well, what does that even mean? Like, if you wanted a cool number to write on it, put X470 on it or something like that. Put the shopping list on it. Put X470, Intel Gigabyte, you know, 10-phase VRM, you know, put the shopping list on there if you want something cool to write on the motherboard. So I like the idea of it. I just wish the writing was a bit more meaningful. Like, for all I know, some of these kanjis could be the kanji for soup or something like that. I don't know. However, as a concept, I really like the look of it, and I'm kind of liking this futuristic design. This is actually a motherboard I would consider running in my home PC, because my home PC I'm kind of picky about aesthetic with. And when I bought my Ryzen 3600 as a demo CPU for the shop, I've actually been kicking around the idea of taking it home and putting it in my PC at home. And in which case, this is definitely a contender motherboard that I would want to put in that PC, where I'm saying, you know, it's, and that's not to say that other motherboards I wouldn't use. The other motherboards that I review they're good boards, they work, they do their job. But for me, when I'm picking something that I really want to look just so and really match the aesthetic, I really care about that, and this really does look swish to me. So enough of my waffle off of the script, let's get into a computer with this thing and let's see what it looks like when it's built into a case. So with the very striking I/O backplate and VRM heatsinks, this motherboard does take center place inside your case, which is a really good thing. I'm always slightly disappointed by motherboards that kind of look a little bit weedy once they're fitted, whereas this one provides just enough sort of bulk and structure that it actually fills the case and makes it look like it's built up without being overly obnoxious, as some motherboards I think can be. Obviously, some of the good stuff like, you know, the PCH cover and things like that, you will lose these behind your graphics card. I've only got a small graphics card in here and I'm struggling to find a camera angle where I can show off that you know, rainbow effect on the STRIX logo and stuff like that. But you can still see all the other metal work across your M2 connector and stuff like that. So it does work out, and at a casual glance, the board looks visually impressive. The RGB is pretty lackluster. If you're trying to do an RGB setup, then this motherboard is not going to help you with that. You only get the logo in the top left there for RGB, and all this other lighting and fans that I've got in here, I've got connected to a controller built into the case, because with only one digital RGB header on the motherboard, you know, it's just you'd have to use splitters to the nth degree. So you know, I feel like I could say that if you're buying an expensive motherboard, you're probably going to be running Corsair iQ or NZXT-Q or something like that. But the thing is, I feel like, you know, it's not difficult to add these RGB headers to the board. And if they added like 2 or 3 of them, well, even if we only had 2 digital RGB headers, you know, a couple of splitters would give you your 4 fans and stuff like that. And I feel like it wouldn't be difficult for motherboard manufacturers to keep a couple of extra RGB headers on the motherboard, and then we wouldn't need dedicated RGB controllers like the iQ or the NZXT-Q. You know, these fans and lights in here, these are being controlled by a really rudimentary RGB controller built into the case, you know. So but I'm not gonna rag on this board just for not having RGB, which isn't to everyone's taste. From a performance perspective, I've been using it on and off for experiments, and it has been absolutely brilliant. I haven't done any serious overclocking on it yet. I will do a video at some point demonstrating how well this thing can try and eke a bit more out of a 3600. However, the design of the VRMs alone gives me extreme confidence in this. And also, it did take my 3400 rated memory straight up to 3600 with absolutely no adjustments at all. Literally just tapped in 3600 and it ran it at 3600 stable. So, you know, memory overclocking on this board is going to be solid as well. And that is really what counts here is, you know, I'm paying money for a premium board, so I expect some measure of premium performance from it. Obviously, the actual raw speed of your computer is going to be exactly the same, which is the reason why I still don't really care about X570, because you're paying, you know, as I say, at the time of recording this video, in the UK at least, you're paying extra for X570 for basically lesser boards. I believe in America it's slightly different. I think some of the X570 boards are just as cheap as X470. So you might make a different decision there. However, this does offer a shiny board for less money. I don't think it's worth £180 or so, not by a long shot. It's just, I really don't think it's worth that price for a previous gen board. But like with the Aorus M that I've been looking at a lot recently, if you find it on sale, if you find it at a low price, then it's actually a really nice board. So this is one to look out for cheap. Having paid £120 for it, I feel quite satisfied. So past that, thank you very much for watching everyone, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.